What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my favorite classes from Elden Ring. Now, over the past week or so, I've been putting out more serious Elden Ring content that was, quite frankly, pretty labor-intensive to make, and I figured today I'd dial it back a bit and do a bit more of a chill video talking just about my favorite parts of the class system that was implemented in-game. Now, as a brief explanation, if you're unaware, classes are really just a jumping off point. They dictate your starting equipment and, of course, kind of your play style in the early game as a result, but they are by no means final, meaning that you can take these guys any which way you please, your character can keep leveling until every stat is maxed out, you can get all of the equipment from some vendor or any area in the game eventually. So you can take literally any of these classes any way you please. They're really just very good jumping off points to kind of get you immediately into the playstyle that you want to be in. Now, that is not going to be news to veterans, of course, but just trying to cover my bases. Now, with no further ado, let's jump into this and talk about my three favorites. Third on the list, we have our astrologer. And that is purely because the astrologer is your mage. And I have previously mentioned how magic can be very overpowered in terms of the damage it does. However, it is worth mentioning that that does come with a trade-off. And while the astrologer, even with their base spells at the beginning of the game, will deal a tremendous amount of damage compared to a melee character, they nonetheless have to balance that with a couple of other things. For starters, their mana or their FP is finite, meaning that they have to use some of the charges on their flasks to get their mana potions to actually be able to cast, because once they run out of mana and they can't cast their spells until they go rest again, their damage goes from being very good to being non-existent. And simply because they have to put points into their weapon stat as well as mind to get more mana, on top of the normal things you have to worry about, they have to spread their stats out a bit more than a melee class will have to right at the beginning. That ultimately makes for a bit of a trade-off in terms of the damage you're getting versus your survivability and your sustained damage. But nonetheless, in spite of all of those things, something that I think Elden Ring does very well when it comes to the magic system in general, and especially with the astrologer right at the beginning of the game, is that it really makes you feel like a battle mage just because of the kind of nature of what you're doing. And I love the RP aspect of it, where it just feels like you're this mage just weaving all this magic, trying to take out all these enemies and stuff. And if nothing else besides the class fantasy, I think astrologer does a great job of getting you into that right at the beginning of the game. Now, moving on to our second spot, we have the confessor. I'm a big fan of the confessor class just because they get some incantations which are similar to sorceries but slightly different, which gives them a bit of utility and an extra heal right at the beginning of the game. But beyond that, they're fairly sword and board. And right at the beginning, you kind of have two, I would say, major options for directions you might want to take them, and that is a more melee-focused character with a bit more of a mana pool than you might normally have and a bit of utility from the incantations, or you can lean more into the incantations and have a slightly different version of a mage. Because while the sorcery spells tend to be more blaster caster stuff, the incantations tend to also have a lot of damage stuff, but in general they just tend to be more varied in terms of what they do and how they do it. You can even get a lot of buffs through incantations. And for instance, one of the ways I like to play personally is focus on a more melee-oriented confessor, but then augment that with the more buff-focused incantation spells like Golden Vow, which just gives you a flat damage buff. But really, my main draw for the confessor is it just kind of addresses how I most like to play the game, really, and that is a little bit of melee mixed with a little bit of magic without going too crazy. And it's just really easy for me to turn the confessor into what I want it to be, and thus it gets the number 2 spot. But that said, the number 1 spot belongs to none other than the wretch. And that is simply because the wretch is your blank slate character. In exchange for not starting the game with any equipment really, they instead have much more balanced stats and are very easy to take in whatever direction you would like to take them in. And while the start of the game will be a little rough on you if it's your first time through, honestly, once you get familiar with it, you can get a wretch up to speed pretty quickly. And the main draw for the wretch for me personally is just the fact that they can be whatever you want them to be. You can perfectly mold them into what you want. And as long as you know where the things are in terms of equipment that you need to make the wretch what you want them to be, the fact that they don't start with any equipment isn't really a barrier for entry. And while I certainly wouldn't recommend a wretch for a first playthrough, in my opinion, the wretch is actually the best class. But again, that's just an opinion. But there you go, guys. Just some thoughts I wanted to share about the classes in Elden Ring and how I personally feel about some of my favorites. Again, not a super serious video. I put out a lot of the more review-oriented content and new player guide, etc. earlier in the week. But by all means, let me know down below what your favorite class is. I am actually pretty fond of the samurai. Just aesthetically, I think that's a really cool one. But again, just let me know down below what your favorite classes are. I would love to hear about it. But if you enjoyed the video, please remember to like, comment, subscribe. If you don't, I can only assume you're maidenless. And as embarrassing as that is, thank you so much for watching nonetheless. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.